want to thank everyone for coming today. We're really pleased to be presenting not one but two talks interrelated. Today we have Lydia Smith-Vaughn, and she is a PhD candidate in the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley. She is also working with North Berkeley National Lab, and she's part of the NG Arctic project. And for those who are less familiar with that project, it's a very large interdisciplinary collaborative project funded by the Department of Energy, and it involves many of the U.S. Department of Energy national labs, as well as an extensive partnership with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Our second presenter will be Dr. Dan Stover. He is a program manager within Terrestrial Ecosystem Science in the Climate and Environmental Sciences Division with DOE, and he is the program manager for NG Arctic. So what we're going to be able to do today is have a really interesting and engaging science talk, and then on the heels of that, some perspective and context from the program manager funding that project on how that specific science links with the funding priorities and science policy for a major agency in the U.S. federal government. So what I will do is, unless anyone has anything we need to deal with in terms of the conference before we get started, Jessica, are we okay to go?
Yeah, I think we're going to be fine. Lydia, I'm on the second layout, and you should be able to click share my screen.
Okay, great. And before I hand it over to Lydia, I'll just mention that we may have a couple of technical glitches with our new webinar software. Hopefully we've got them all sorted out, but we'll take care of those as they come up if we have any. And with that, what I will do is hand it over to Lydia and look forward to hearing her presentation.
Hey, Andrew, will you explain the question and answer system too?
Okay, yeah, I can do that now. Because we have so many people expected on the webinar today, what we've decided to do is handle question and answer using chat. So the idea is that all the attendees in the meeting are going to be kept on mute, because with this many people, it's difficult to keep the audio clean. So what we'll do is take the questions in the chat area, and then I can relay them verbally to the speaker. And our plan for this is that after Lydia's talk, if there are any questions that are really specific to her science that should be asked right then and there, we'll take a few questions on that, and then we'll move relatively quickly into Dan. So with that, I think we may be ready to get going and hand it over to Lydia.
Well, great. Thank you for that introduction, Andrew. And because this is also my first time using this platform, my understanding is that you should all be able to see the presentation right now, but either Andrew or Jessica, since I can hear you, please just let me know if anything is going on, not working correctly with that.
It looks good right now.
Thanks. Sounds great. Thank you. So as Andrew said, I'm going to start things off with a science talk in which I'm going to present on a field study that we did as part of the NG Arctic project that looked at mechanistic linkages between landscape microtopography, permafrost thaw, and methane emissions. And I also, at the end of the talk, just want to spend a couple minutes before we go into Dan's discussion on model experiment integration, in which I just discuss how this research that I'm presenting today can be useful for models. So as was mentioned, today's project that I'm presenting was done as part of the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiments, or NG Arctic, which is a multi-year effort that's aimed at improving large-scale models of the Arctic by combining observational, experimental, and modeling efforts. And from my perspective, this has been a wonderful opportunity to work with a highly interdisciplinary group that comes from a range of institutions, all of whom are coordinating research efforts on topics such as hydrology, geophysics, vegetation, biogeochemistry, all of which have the combined goal of improving Earth system models. So this approach of model experiment integration is certainly fundamental to the DOE's mission in funding NG Arctic. So as such, the overall approach of NG Arctic is to integrate essentially all aspects of the terrestrial Arctic ecosystem that are relevant to climate. And today I'm going to discuss just one piece of that picture, which, as we will get into, is methane emissions and their controls. So to motivate this talk, the first thing I want to impress upon you all is that methane is one important potential contributor to climate change in the Arctic. Even though methane is not being emitted from the tundra as rapidly as CO2, methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. What that means is that over a 100-year timeline, each ton of methane that gets emitted has a global warming effect of approximately 30 tons of CO2, which is equal to saying that on a molecule-for-molecule basis, each molecule of methane affects the climate as strongly as approximately 11 molecules of CO2. Now, according to our current estimates, the Arctic tundra is emitting between 9 and 35 teragrams of methane per year, which, if that's put in perspective relative to global emissions, it's as high as 18% of natural emissions or 6% of total global emissions. And while these absolute numbers that I'm telling you now are quite high, what I really want to impress upon you is that the uncertainty in these current estimates is very, very high. These estimates that I present here range from nearly fourfold, from 9 to 35 teragrams per year. And this broad range is the result that you see here as a result of a synthesis of different modeling and empirical estimates, which are based in fundamentally different estimation approaches. And overall, this high degree of uncertainty is due to several factors. First of all, methane fluxes vary widely in both space and time. Their biogeochemical controls are complex and in many cases uncertain. And as a result of these two things, our models are poorly constrained. Given this uncertainty about present-day emissions, future Arctic emissions are also highly uncertain. We know that soils in the Arctic that are currently frozen are expected to thaw, and also landscapes are likely to get, in some cases, wetter, in other cases, drier. So to improve our knowledge of both present-day and also future methane emissions, this project that I'm presenting today was motivated by a need for more observational studies that look across a broad range of landscape types, and very importantly, studies that are directly targeted toward improving models. This project was conducted in Barrow, Alaska, on the Barrow Environmental Observatory, which was the site for a broad range of integrated field measurements during the first phase of the NG Arctic project. This is a region that has continuous permafrost extending as deep as greater than 400 meters, and it has a shallow active layer that ranges from approximately 20 to 70 centimeters. Within this region, roughly 65% of the land surface is covered by formations that are known as ice wedge polygons. And so just to explain a little bit more about this type of polygon tundra, these here are aerial photos from our site that show different types of these formations called ice wedge polygons. On the left, you see low-centered polygons, and then you see what are known as high-centered polygons on the right. And I have to apologize that there aren't scale bars on these images, but just know that the polygons on the left are on the order of roughly 15 or 20 meters across. So these polygons initially form as low-centered polygons, which occurs due to the growth of large blocks of subsurface ice that are called ice wedges. And you can see these ice wedges in these bottom cross-sectional diagrams. They're the sort of upside-down stylized triangles. And these ice wedges grow over time, impeding drainage and accordingly leading to soil uplift at the same time. This process generates low-centered polygons, like you see on the left, which have raised, relatively dry rims, low inundated centers, and saturated or inundated troughs that separate individual polygons. So in these photos, what you see as green is actually standing water, which you see as green because of aquatic plants. Then over time, these ice wedges, in many cases, can degrade, which leads to ice wedge melting, and then they can reform as what are known as secondary ice wedges, which leads to a successional process in which these low-centered polygons can drain and transition to become high-centered polygons, like you see here in the right-hand images. So importantly, this successional process, which occurs with permafrost degradation, creates strong differences in the landscape in hydrology, in soil temperature, vegetation, and soil chemistry, all of which are important factors for carbon cycling. So at our research site, we're offered clear spatial gradients that span polygon types and degrees of permafrost degradation, in which regions that have low-centered polygons transition fairly smoothly into those with high-centered polygons, even though the site doesn't have any overall large-scale topography. This offers us the opportunity to ask questions about the influences of permafrost degradation and associated microtopography on a range of ecosystem processes. And for clarification, what I mean by microtopography is topography on the scale of individual polygons, which varies in elevation by at most a meter or so. So with this background, the two questions that framed this study were first, how do surface greenhouse gas emissions vary across spatial gradients? And second, how do these surface emissions rates relate to spatial patterns in methane production and methane consumption? And here I'm referring to two different types of microbial process. First, the process of methane production in anaerobic soils. And then second, the consumption, which is also known as oxidation of methane, by bacteria that acquire energy by converting methane to CO2. And to evaluate these questions, we made use of three spatial gradients available in the landscape. First was the gradient of permafrost degradation from low-centered to flat and high-centered polygons. Second, we looked across positions within individual polygons. And these are polygon centers, rims, and troughs, which you can see clearly marked on the bottom image here. And then the third gradient we looked at was depth within the soil. So to evaluate these questions, we collected samples in 6 field campaigns occurring over 2 years. And in each of these campaigns, we sampled from 3 low-centered and 4 dry-centered polygons. And here I just introduced some new terminology, which is dry-centered polygons. And for statistical reasons, we grouped the flat and high-centered polygons into a combined category that we call dry-centered polygons. And from each of these polygons, we collected samples from the center, the rim, and the trough, which gave us a total of 21 locations. And then from each of those locations, we sampled to 3 depths below the surface, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, and to the full depth of the thawed layer, or the thawed soil, which ranged spatially and seasonally from 15 to 53 centimeters. During each of these sampling campaigns, we took a range of measurements and samples, which included surface emissions of methane and CO2, which we measured using static chambers, as well as soil temperature and surface soil moisture. And we also collected soil pore gas or soil pore water from 3 different depths. And from those samples, we measured concentrations of methane and CO2, as well as their isotopic compositions. So with that introduction, I'm now going to jump straight into a few results figures. And I know I was brief with the methods, but if people have methodological questions, I'd be happy to answer that during the Q&A. So our first analysis, which is pictured here, was to look at greenhouse gas fluxes across spatial gradients and throughout the season. And in these figures, the x-axis is polygon type. And here, DC stands for dry-centered polygons, so that's flat and high-centered polygons. And LC stands for low-centered polygons. And the y-axis is the net flux, or in other words, the net emissions of methane or CO2. And then each of the individual panels you see is a different sampling month. With these data, our aim was to identify the most important predictors of greenhouse gas emissions out of a set of possible candidate predictors. And those possible predictors that we evaluated were polygon type, position within the polygon, sampling month, soil temperature, surface soil moisture, depth of soil thaw at the time of sampling, and the two-way interactions between these variables. So to evaluate these, I used a method of linear mixed effects modeling that essentially just chooses the most important predictor variables while accounting for spatial clustering and repeated measurements from the same locations. So as you can see clearly in the top image here, we found that methane emissions do vary predictably across polygon types and features. The best model that we found predicting methane emissions included polygon type, position within the polygon, soil temperature, and the 3 two-way interactions between these variables as predictor variables. Now, surprisingly, I just want to quickly point out that soil moisture was not included in the optimal model. The going wisdom, which I'm certainly not going to dispute, is that soil moisture is an important predictor of methane flux. Now, the fact that this was omitted from our model, I want to emphasize, does not mean that there's no significant correlation between soil moisture and methane flux. Instead, what it implies is that polygon type and position are even better predictors of methane flux than surface soil moisture, and that when these other variables are included in the model, soil moisture doesn't meaningfully add any further explanatory power. So this essentially means that here we see polygons acting as functional units for methane emissions in a way that is not captured by moisture measurements alone. And then briefly, as for CO2 emissions, the best model we found included only measurement month as a predictor. This simply suggests that the patterns that we saw in methane emissions were not directly tied to overall rates of soil carbon decomposition. Our second analysis was to assess the predictors of microbial methane production mechanism. And that was in order to look at how mechanistic variations that we saw in the production mechanism related to our emissions observations that we just looked at. So before going into the details of this figure, I know I have a broad audience, so I want to just offer a really quick isotope background for those of you who don't work with stable isotopes. And don't worry, I'll keep this very brief. You'll see on the y-axis here that the amount of the 13C isotope is expressed in what's known as delta notation, and that has units of parts per thousand or per mil. So this may look kind of confusing to non-isotope people, but really all you need to know here is that this is a common stable isotope unit that expresses the abundance of 13C in the sample relative to that of a standard material. So this just makes different samples easily comparable in terms of their 13C abundance. So with this notation, if a sample equaled a standard, its delta 13C value would be 0 per mil. And if the sample had less 13C than the standard, which is generally the case for methane and other biologically made materials, its delta 13C value would be negative, which is the case that you see in the figure here. So with that really brief isotope background, these 13C values can also tell us important information about the microbial process that was used to produce the methane we measured. And here we're considering two primary processes of methane production, which generate methane that has distinct ranges of these delta 13C values. One of these processes is known as acetate cleavage, and this process uses acetate as a substrate for methane, which produces methane that has relatively high or less negative delta 13C values. The other process is CO2 reduction, and in this process, microbes use carbon dioxide and hydrogen to produce methane. And methane produced by this CO2 reduction pathway tends to have relatively low 13C values. And the red shaded region that you see here simply shows the overlap between the characteristic delta 13C ranges of these two processes. So with these data, I used the same general modeling approach that I did with surface emissions. And I found that the only predictor variables in the optimal model predicting 13C were polygon type, position within the polygon, and the interaction between polygon type and position. So this tells us, first of all, that acetate cleavage is more important in low-centered polygons than it is in dry-centered polygons. So the dark green boxes are consistently higher here than the light green boxes. Second of all, we can see that within the dry-centered polygons, acetate cleavage is a more important methane production pathway in the troughs than it is in the centers or the rims, all of which are dominated by CO2 reduction. And then finally, when we compare the rims of the two polygon types, even though these two features have similar properties of temperature, soil moisture, and thaw depth, they're dominated by different methane production mechanisms. So here, again, we see that microtopographic features are acting as functional units for methane processes. With these 13C data, we can see mechanistic patterns that mirror roughly the spatial patterns that we saw in methane emissions, with methane production pathway mapping pretty closely to methane emissions. So this third results figure also shows delta 13C values of methane, but in this case, we're looking at how these 13C values change with depth. So what you see here, the dark blue samples are the deepest samples that were collected at the frost table. The shallowest samples were collected at 10 centimeters depth, and then what's listed as the middle samples were collected at 20 centimeters depth. So while the previous slide gave us insight into methane production, these depth profiles tell us something about methane oxidation, or in other words, the amount of methane that gets consumed by bacteria in the different polygon features. So this process of methane oxidation can be a very important control on the amount of methane that gets emitted from the soil surface, even in situations like our site, where we know that methane is being produced in all locations in deep anaerobic soil layers. In most of the profiles here, particularly in the dry-centered polygon centers and rims, we can see that the 13C values become higher as we move from the deep soil toward the surface. This is the trend that we would expect to see with methane oxidation, because when bacteria oxidize methane, they preferentially use carbon-12, which leaves the remaining methane enriched in carbon-13. As a notable exception, I do want to point out the centers of low-centered polygons in the right panel, which, if anything, have slightly lower 13C values at shallower depths. This suggests that very little methane oxidation is occurring in these locations, which is certainly one factor that contributes to their high surface rates of methane emissions. So here, I have just showed you 3 figures addressing different aspects of the system. But in order to think about how these results fit into a synthetic framework, I find it useful to consider where the different polygon features fall on a set of axes, here with methane oxidation rate increasing in the vertical dimension and methane production rate increasing from left to right. So on these sets of axes, the top left corner is where I would place dry-centered polygon centers and rims. These features have low rates of methane emission, which is due to a combination of relatively low rates of production, which is typical when CO2 reduction is the dominant production mechanism, and also high rates of oxidation, as we're able to infer from the steep 13C profiles that we saw in the previous figure. In contrast, I would place the 2 features that are most highly methane emitting in the bottom right corner. And here in the bottom right corner are features that have a combination of high rates of methane production, which is typical when acetate cleavage dominates methane production, and also low rates of oxidation, which we can infer from the relatively flat 13C profiles in the last figure. And then the remaining two features have pretty moderate methane emissions, so I've placed them somewhere in the middle of this figure. The 13C results that we looked at suggest that both of these features have a mix of the two methane production mechanisms, and they also have a moderate degree of oxidation. Now, it may be the case that one of these features has higher rates of both production and oxidation than the other, but whether either one of these features would fall more toward the bottom left or toward the top right corner of this diagram is not entirely clear from our data. So one other thing that I would like to add to this figure is soil moisture. And here, when we add this, we see what we would expect in the top left and in the bottom right corners, with soil moisture mapping to methane production, methane oxidation, and surface methane emissions. In this middle region, however, again, this clear-cut relationship between moisture and methane once again breaks down. And so to explain what's actually going on in these two features in the middle, I would hypothesize that two primary factors are responsible. And the first of these factors that I want to discuss very briefly is vegetation. So this table here shows vegetation data that were collected from an adjacent set of polygons at our site. Now, broadly speaking, vegetation is well known to be an important predictor of methane emissions, as a number of different types of wetland plants are able to transport methane through hollow tissues. And this allows methane to bypass oxidation that would otherwise occur in shallow soil layers. So in accordance, this table shows a clear relationship between vegetation cover and methane emissions, particularly with respect to Carex aquatilis. So what you see there in the Carex aquatilis column. And that's a sedge that's known to be important for methane transport. So we can see here that Carex aquatilis roughly correlates with methane emissions. We see, first of all, high cover of Carex in the low-centered polygon centers and troughs. We see intermediate cover. Sorry, my slides have a slight delay, in the dry-centered troughs and in the rims of low-centered polygons, and we see low cover elsewhere. So with this, we simply see that vegetation is probably an important mechanistic link tying together microtopography, permafrost degradation, and methane emissions. The second factor that might explain our results is hydrology and its influence on redox, or in other words, the energetic ability to produce or oxidize methane. So first, from a study led by Brent Newman, who's another researcher with NG Arctic working at the same site, we know that dissolved oxygen and sulfate concentrations are significantly higher in the troughs of high-centered polygons than in the troughs of low-centered polygons, which broadly indicates that there are redox differences between these two types of saturated areas. And additionally, in a separate modeling study conducted by Anna Liliadal from the NG Arctic group, she found that runoff rates were about twice as high from high-centered polygons as they were from low-centered polygons. So here, combining these two lines of evidence, I would hypothesize that higher runoff from high-centered polygons has the effect of increasing electron acceptor availability in the troughs of those high-centered polygons, inhibiting methane production and promoting methane oxidation relative to other saturated areas, such as low-centered polygon centers and low-centered polygon troughs. As I said, this is just a hypothesis, but it is one possibility that some members of the NG Arctic team do plan to explore farther. So this summer, for example, we do have some plans to combine co-located sampling of geochemistry, hydrology, and surface methane and CO2 emissions with fine-scale 3D mechanistic modeling. So now, just to summarize the main findings of this study, first, we find that methane production, oxidation, and net emissions are organized into discrete microtopographic units, and that this relationship does not directly map to soil moisture. Second, most published studies have looked at methane emissions in production in places where permafrost thaw has the effect of increasing inundation. And these studies generally find higher methane emissions in thawed areas. In this study, we do find the opposite, with lower methane emissions with permafrost degradation. So this leads to our third finding, which is that in locations where permafrost degradation leads to soil drainage and drying, such as in this type of polygon tundra, we may expect to see local reductions in surface methane emissions occurring with climate change. Now, in my last couple minutes here, I just want to quickly highlight this first point about polygons acting as functional units. And this is as an example of the model experiment integration approach that is fundamental to NG Arctic, or as we've been calling it, and as I believe you'll also hear from Dan, this is known as the ModeX approach. So the existence of these natural functional polygonal units has helped the NG Arctic modeling team address a very fundamental challenge, which is how to span spatial scales from that of the individual profile, which is often the scale of measurement, up to the scale of the entire watershed. In addressing this challenge, members of the NG Arctic modeling team are developing an intermediate scale model that takes advantage of the fact that at the scale pictured in the grid here, polygons act as natural scaling units for a whole range of factors that include thermal conditions, soil moisture, and as today's study highlights, also certain decomposition processes. So this ability to use these polygonal functional units offers computational advantages and allows the model to more easily bridge the scale of observation and the scale of the entire watershed. So in addition, one other final take home that I do need to emphasize is something that's common to all aspects of the ModeX approach, which is that a key goal with this type of study should be bridging the gap between what we're able to measure through observation and the metrics used in models as parameters and as outputs. So with that, I would just like to thank our funders at the DOE and acknowledge that there were many members of the NG Arctic team involved in this project. So I think I'm going to have just a couple questions or a couple minutes to take questions before Dan takes over. But leading into that, I also just really briefly want to mention that I've just learned about a model data synthesis effort that is very topical to what I'm discussing here. And that's one that's being led by Dave McGuire on roughly the same subject. And I know you can find information about this on the IARPC website. As far as I understand, this is still in fundraising stages, but sounds like they have a really neat goal that starts with hosting a workshop this fall focused on synthesizing more data with models to better reconcile the methane budget in the northern permafrost region. So with that, I guess we'll just take a couple minutes before Dan's presentation if anyone has questions about what I've just discussed here.
Great, thank you very much, Lydia. And also thank you for that segue to Dave McGuire's methane scaling workshop. Brendan Kelly and I are also helping him organize that, but he's really the one in charge. And before we take a couple of questions, I'm wondering if Dave has anything he'd like to type to add to what you said. And while we're waiting for Dave to type any potential additional comments, I'll relay the first question that we got for you, which is, has anyone looked into conductivity values for these pockets? I have a model that maps wet and dry materials, and we're trying to develop a new instrument to detect shallow differential layering of wet and dry materials. Is this type of research useful or supportive in your work in terms of a non-invasive detection mapping? And that is from C. Geiger.
Geez, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how that would integrate with the models. It seems like that is the stage at which it would be most useful in integrating with this work. It's another important piece that could be brought in with the modeling effort. In terms of The observational work that I showed here, it's another really interesting line of research, but somewhat tangential to the actual analyses that we are able to do with this type of data. But I do think that's something that's absolutely worth discussing with modelers who are working on evaluating methane processes, particularly from a mechanistic standpoint.
Okay, great, thank you. And there is a follow-up, which is regarding upscaling issues. Okay, this is a comment. Our work with sea ice charts faces the same challenges, and we made quite some headway. I can speak with the speaker offline. Okay, if I can get her email. Okay, so I apologize in advance for any awkwardness and ham-fistedness on my part handling the Q&A this way, interpreting the text that people are writing. And it looks like Dave has added a comment as well. Thank you, Lydia. Very clear presentation, exciting results, no additional comments. Okay, so for anyone involved in the topic, keep in mind that we are hoping to have a methane scaling workshop sometime late fall or winter, and more details will come out on that, including the IARPC website, among other channels, as it develops. And with that, I think we may be ready. I believe we are ready to switch to Dan's presentation. And as long as he is ready to go and all the audio is working, we will switch over to Dan.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Dan Stover. I am the program manager for the Terrestrial Ecosystem Sciences program here at the Department of Energy Office of Science. And this is the program that is the primary sponsor for the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment in the Arctic. This is one of two NG experiments that we have. The sister project, which launched last year, is located in the tropics. So I will move to the next slide here. And as many of you have heard government presentations before, it's not complete without usually an org chart here, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview just to show that we see NG not as a particular project that falls within one activity or one program, but it has connections to multiple programs within our office here. And as you can see within the Office of Science and the Office of Biological and Environmental Research in our division, the Climate and Environmental Sciences, there are three major programs in atmospheric sciences, climate modeling, and of course the environmental system science where I reside. But you can see where the types of research that's being sponsored here is, it kind of touches across many of these different areas. To give you an idea about the budget for our division is roughly about $310 million that's spread roughly evenly amongst the three main thrusts here, the atmosphere modeling and the environmental system science. But more particularly to my program, the TES program, and the foundational goal for us is to improve the representation of terrestrial ecosystem processes in Earth system models, thereby improving our quality of climate predictions, climate model predictions. And this is to, again, DOE is a mission agency here, and that we do this to meet the energy and environmental challenges that face the U.S. and particularly the U.S. Department of Energy. But I think that it's important what kind of frames the way that we do business here is this approach, and Lydia did a great job of explaining this coupled model experiment approach is the way that we kind of address things. And we target systems that kind of meet these three criteria here in terms of our approach. These are processes or ecosystems that are globally or regionally significant, climatically sensitive, or insufficiently understood or represented in our predictive models. So through that, we've used a number of different approaches over the years in this program. So the TES program has been around for 6 years. And prior to that, there were two smaller programs, one in carbon research and one in ecosystem research that were combined about the time that I came to DOE. But we've built on a long history of approaches here, one being observations, such as our Ameriflux network, large-scale long-term manipulations. This is included in our prior free air carbon exchange CO2 enrichment experiments, the FACE experiments, our NG experiments that we use here, and our spruce experiment, which is a spruce peatland response under climate experiment, which is a large open-top chamber experiment in a peat bog in northern Minnesota. And again, that we use these, we asked folks to ask the research questions in the context of how the models, care about this and why do they need to incorporate these processes. We do provide funding to both the DOE national laboratories and to universities, and we do release an annual university funding opportunity announcement. That's our equivalent to like a request for proposals. And again, moving to the next slide, as Lydia mentioned before, it's this ModeX approach which really defines our program and the way that we do business here. And this is foundationally, we've had, in the past, the modeling community often reaches out to the empirical or the field research community saying, we don't have the right type of processes or data to validate or parameterize our models. But the empirical side of the community, the field research community often says, but we've published a lot of this, and so these two communities really weren't engaging each other in a productive or fruitful way. So what we've done is we've created an approach here which these two communities have to work together. So it's this predictive understanding to get to this is you basically link modelers and empiricists or the field research observationalist communities together. And the idea is to coordinate this so that we maximize the return on our scientific investment. We don't see this as a one-way dialogue. This is not the modelers telling the field community where to go do their research, but it's a two-way dialogue where the experimental community can help tell the modelers, like, whoa, CLM or the Century model isn't doing this right. You're black boxing the microbial community or the root community in a way that just doesn't make biological sense, and it's going to give you a wrong prediction. So it allows the empirical community to work with the modelers, and the modelers come back saying, where the biggest amount of uncertainty or sensitivity in our model is. So it allows these two to work together. But it's not a one-way dialogue. It's an iterative dialogue. But we also still recognize the importance of discovery science, things that aren't ready yet for prime time into the models. So a few years ago, we did launch the NG activity. NG Arctic was our first one, and this is led by Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Stan Wolschlager is the lead PI, but it is a consortium of DOE national laboratories, including Brookhaven National Lab, Los Alamos, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, as well as a number of academic partners, and primarily the largest partner is University of Alaska Fairbanks. And in fact, our chief scientist for the project comes from University of Alaska Fairbanks. But the overarching goal for NG is to advance the predictive understanding of the structure and function of Arctic terrestrial ecosystems in response to a changing climate. And specifically, their objective here is to develop a process-rich ecosystem model that extends from the bedrock to the atmospheric boundary layer. We used to say the vegetative canopy, but more towards the atmospheric boundary layer now, so that we can examine the evolution of these permafrost-dominated ecosystems as they undergo thawing and various other climatic disturbances at a high-resolution grid cell, which is approximately thinking about maybe 30 by 30 or even smaller grid cell size. We see this as a great approach to collaborate with other institutions, other researchers in the Arctic. I'm sure as many of you have found, once you get up into the Arctic, it's almost like an acronym soup of other groups that are working up there, and our goal here is not to go in and reinvent the wheel, but to collaborate and work with others where appropriate. We see this as a very, very collaborative community, very friendly community to work with, and we've been very, very impressed. Just to clarify, too, one thing I didn't say before, DOE does not have an Arctic research program. This happens to be a 10-year effort that we're making, particularly in my program, at least for NG. There are a number of other Arctic efforts that are going on, such as the Atmospheric Radiation Measurement Facility. There's a number of sea ice modeling projects that are going on as well through our office. So, but there's not a DOE particular Arctic program like there would be, let's say, at NSF, but we have placed some investments in there due to the uncertainties in our predictive capabilities. NG Arctic is currently just started its second phase of a 10-year project, so this is to cover the 2016 to 2018, 2019 period. Next slide. This is kind of a wordy slide here. I don't intend for you to look at it, but you can find my slides online as well if you want to go into a little more detail, but this is just kind of showing the evolution of the three different phases of the project that would span a decade. The first one really focused a lot on getting some boots on the ground, but primarily working on modeling capabilities and how NG would deal with the scalability, or how do you scale from a plot scale to a regional or circumpolar scale. In phase two, in phase one, the majority of the work was focused in Barrow, Alaska, and in phase two, there will be work that will continue in Barrow, Alaska, but then they've also continued to develop a second field campaign or field area of interest, which is near Council on the Seward Peninsula. And then in phase three, that will continue on to wrap up some of those process studies that's been dealing primarily with spatial and temporal characterization of these processes, both from microbiology, biogeochemistry, hydrology, vegetation, and wrapping all that up into a model component right now that's being called the Arctic Terrestrial Simulator, which could be able to link into large-scale modeling efforts. Again, we see this as a growing partnership. DOE, this is a fairly large investment. NG is a $10 million a year activity, so over the 10 years will be a $100 million effort. Again, between the DOE National Labs, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Lawrence Berkeley, and Brookhaven, and our large academic partner here, which is UAF. But through interagency collaboration and coordination efforts through the U.S. Global Change Research Program, we've been able to work with the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group to partner up with NASA through two particular campaigns. The first was the CARV campaign, which was an atmospheric and remote sensing-based campaign, where we were able to provide ground truthing measurements for the flights that were flying over the Barrow, Alaska, or the BEO, the Barrow Experimental Observatory area. A new activity which is spinning up in NASA, and I think may now be going into its second year now, is the NASA Above. This is the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, which will span Alaska, parts of Alaska, and Western Canada. And we're in the final stages, it should be signed this week, the formal agreement, the Memorandum of Understanding of how NASA and DOE will work together, and how the NG and Above projects will actually have collaborators on their scientific advisory teams, and that we will coordinate, PI meetings so that these teams can work more robustly, given that we have different interests in the Arctic, but there's a lot of opportunity for the data products to be shared amongst one another and the modeling components to be shared, particularly since Above will get more towards disturbance such as fire and such. So with that, the only final things that I would like to say, before I take questions here is I know many people often ask me, how do you get engaged into the NG project? And the first thing I often tell people is to reach out to the NG team is the quickest and most efficient way, especially if you have data products or research sites or capabilities that you would like to share or collaborate with them. In terms of funding, again, we do annual announcements for universities to collaborate or to propose science that would nest within NG, or in some cases just happen to be co-located in the Arctic. This year we were able to support some projects. Next year our funding announcement is we're going collaboratively with the NASA ROSES call, and ROSES is Research Opportunities in Space and Earth Sciences. That call actually closes, I believe tomorrow is the deadline for proposals, and one of the topic areas in there is Arctic Boreal Critical Ecosystems. And DOE is currently, at least for next year, that is the only topic area that we're going to solicit proposals for through NASA ROSES, and that's all dependent on how the outcome of the FY17 budget. But in FY18 and beyond, we'll go back to having our own individual solicitation in which we do call out critical ecosystems. The specific subtopics may change from year to year, but we do tend to keep the Arctic as being a core area of interest since we've made such a large investment through NG there, and we're always looking for collaborators. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate that, and I think especially for those of us, most of us, who don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the program management or project administration end of things, that background on Arctic research policy within an agency and the rationale for how the research is structured is really, really helpful and enlightening. Also, I was wondering, too, this came up briefly the other day, and I was curious if you might say a little more about it to the larger audience. To some degree, there's a little bit of cross-pollination among program managers at different agencies. So, for example, between DOE and NASA, and obviously post facto, there are ways to leverage synergies among programs like that, say, for example, between NG and above, and so people are already doing that. I was kind of curious if you'd say a little bit on the degree to which you interact with program managers from other agencies really a priori and think way in advance when ideas for calls are being developed, how much cross-pollination there is among the different federal agencies that way.
Yeah, and so it is variable in terms of topic area. What I do find is the U.S. Global Change Research Program, USGCRP, has been a really useful tool for us to do that, and particularly the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group has been pretty productive over the years. And the program managers there tend to work together when a call comes out. We typically, or when we're thinking about pulling together an announcement, we typically talk to one another and highlight, what it is we're looking for. In some cases, we have received proposals in that it's like, this is not quite a fit for us, but we sometimes will talk to the other program managers, the other agencies, saying, I think this is right up your alley. And so we've had opportunities where we've co-funded proposals before, where we would pick up the piece that's more DOE focused and maybe USDA picks up another piece. We've done that before, particularly through the NASA Roses call, but through other opportunities as well. But also there's just a slew of activities that are going on down at the at USGCRP that have enabled federal partners to come together to start thinking about these challenging issues such as Arctic ecosystems and climate change and how do we manage that and coordinate our efforts instead of becoming duplicative. So the word duplicative is almost a kill switch for Congress and other the OMB, the Office of Budget and Management, that decides our budget and pushes it up through the presidential process. So USGCRP has been great about helping us coordinate and to collaborate, as providing a venue for us to do that. And we're also thinking a little more I would say, slightly longer term here is through USGCRP, there are a set of what we call priorities that are developed that John Holdren, who is the National Science Advisor for the President, often pushes forward to OMB that kind of percolate up through USGCRP. And one of the major areas that's come up is Arctic science. Not only is, the chairmanship for the Arctic Research Council coming up from, is now currently under the U.S., but there's been just a large push, and that's also represented by the president actually going to Alaska to speak during the Arctic summits that happened earlier this past year. So yeah, it's a great venue for that to happen. We do talk, we do share our science, we share our funding opportunities between the program managers, and we really are active in trying to figure out how do we get the largest return on our investments. So great,
thank you. Yeah, that's great perspective on how Arctic research fits in interagency space, and yeah, I guess that's what IARPC's all about. And it looks like we also have a question from Robert Rich. What are some of the major challenges you had to overcome to bring the NG team together productively?
Yeah, so from my perspective, one of the big challenges is well, I guess two challenges. One is, when you go into a new environment, DOE is not a, what you would think of as traditionally as an Arctic research program type of community. And, when we developed NG, we were driven by the fact that the models didn't get Arctic right, and didn't get Arctic permafrost all right. And we knew that was, in fact, Peter Thornton so eloquently said one day, he was like, the problem with permafrost is CLM considers that a no-exchange boundary layer. Nothing, sunlight bounces off of it and that's it. It doesn't thaw, it doesn't melt. Carbon goes down, but nothing ever comes up. So we knew that's a big problem, so we've got to address that. So that kind of led to that. Developing NG as a project was a bit of a challenge in that, we forced the DOE national labs that typically, this sounds bad when I say this, but it's not as bad as this, that historically have often ran individual projects, and this time we realized that no one lab had the entire intellectual capability or resources to do this project. Some labs are really good at, let's say, vegetation modeling. Some labs are really good at experimental biogeochemistry. Some labs are really, have an expertise in genomics or in microbiology. And so we created a team. And we also wanted to make sure there was an opportunity for the non-lab component to come into this. So getting all those pieces to come together and work as a team instead of individual projects under the auspice of NG, I think was a little bit of a paradigm shift for the way that we do business. But I will say that this team, although it's large and it's a large investment, has turned out very well. It's probably, from my perspective, one of both of our NG projects really are work very well together. Those teams are really dedicated to what what their mission and what their objective is here. I go to the all hands meetings every year at AGU, and it's just amazing the amount of science that we're getting off this, and the fact that one of the other challenges that we had was are we going to go up there in the community, the community that's already been working in these ecosystems? Is it going to be a challenge, kind of getting our foothold in there to work and collaborate with them? Sometimes you go to areas and you get the pushback saying, it's the government, they're coming here, they don't know what they're doing. But we were welcomed. And so we were worried about that that aspect coming together, and the fact that the Arctic research community very broadly was very welcoming and wanted to help us and had lots of great suggestions of what we, where to go and what topics and what areas that they could collaborate with. So that's been a highlight. I think the most difficult thing that I've had to deal with as a program manager is finding people that are non-conflict of interest reviewers for these Arctic proposals, because it's a big community, but it's a small collaborative community. So trying to find people that haven't collaborated or aren't conflicted to review proposals has become probably the biggest challenge for me. If anyone wants to toss themselves under the bus and volunteer to be a reviewer, I'm happy to take your name and add you to a list. So.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, it's really nice to hear that the reaction you got was immediately engaging and welcoming from the existing Arctic research community, and as a member of that community, I like to think that's typical. Yeah, man, it seems like NG Arctic is a really great single agency example of something between all the national labs that we're hoping is a good example and metaphor for what can happen more and more among the federal agencies as time moves forward, and the need for better leveraging complementary skill sets among agencies and more sophisticated collaborations continues to grow. I'm looking at the Q&A list here. I'm not seeing any other questions typed right now. We are exactly at our 1 hour mark, which might mean, unless there's some additional questions, and I'll wait for a minute or so to see if there are any, but we may be hitting the timing perfectly as well with this. So while I'm waiting for anyone else to type in an additional question, I'll take this opportunity again to thank both Dan and Lydia. I really enjoyed that. And I really appreciate the time that you spent both preparing and giving your presentations today.